Welcome everyone, whether you are a member of the International Society for Science and Religion, or for IRAS, the Institute on Religion in an Age of Science, or perhaps some other science and religion organization, or perhaps just interested in the topic. What could be more fascinating, more urgent, more important than to think together about climate, biodiversity, and the human future. And tonight we have one of the most distinguished experts in that field to speak to us. We're going to hear from Professor Dr. Lisa Fullam, who, as you have just heard, has been since 2003 a member of the faculty of the Jesuit School of Theology at Santa Clara University. Her field there is defined as moral theology. And in case that seems kind of heavy or opaque, it is neither. It is urgent, it is important, it is timely. It is an effort to bring the best of traditional insight, stretching all the way back to Aristotle, of course, into the present debate about what it means to be human, how human beings flourish, and how we can live together responsibly into the future. She is the professor there at Jesuit School of Theology and teaches courses that range from virtue ethics, sexual and medical ethics, and Ignatian spirituality. Fascinating array of topics. Essays include Toward a Virtue Ethics of Marriage, Augustine and Aquinas on Friendship in Marriage, or on Joan of Arc. And I love the subtitle here, Holy Resistance and Conscience Formation in the Face of Social Sin. Her books include The Virtue of Humility. I hope that's selling well. The Virtue of Humility, a Thomistic apologetic, and co-edited with the distinguished Charles Curran, 3 volumes in the Paulist Press series, Readings in Moral Theology. Now, after she speaks on this enigmatic topic of how can you be a dinosaur and a meteor at the same time, after she speaks, we're going to have a comment and some questions from Professor Emeritus David Larrabee, coming from East Stroudsburg University. And he's going to pose several questions. We're going to have an open mic for Professor Larrabee. And then our main speaker, Dr. Fullam, is going to reply to those comments and questions. And then, dear friends, we're going to open up the program for your questions and comments. If you look down to the bottom of your screen, maybe you have to guide the cursor down to illuminate that bar at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a link that says Q&A. I see somebody's already found it because I've already got questions in the Q&A queue. So add your questions to that. Make sure it's a question. Make sure it's succinct and timely, and I will read those questions here and queue them up for our speaker, and we'll go at it for a while, as long as good questions drive a productive conversation. So perhaps a few minutes overtime, as our friend Maynard has already suggested. Well, one final thing I found that you might ask about if we run out of other things to talk about. I read somewhere that Dr. Fullam has climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. And maybe you want to ask her about the struggle of the climb and the view from the top. So with that, Lisa, let's go ahead. It's all yours.
Okay, thank you very much for your kind introduction, and welcome everybody. I'm in the middle of sharing my screen, which then allows me to take the next step toward getting the video going, which looks like that. So with any luck, you're all seeing a lovely green dinosaur just now. So let's leap in, shall we? Back in 2019, the spring semester of 2019, I taught at Hekima College in Nairobi in Kenya. And before I came home, I took some time to go to the Bwindi Impenetrable Forest in Uganda, which looks like this from the outside. And where, after a grueling 2-hour trek into the aptly named park, we finally reached this lovely girl, just sitting and noshing on a sweet plant that our guide described as gorilla sugarcane. Mountain gorillas are endangered. Only a few more than 1,000 exist. Unlike other species of gorillas, they do poorly in captivity. They, in the areas where they exist, a few family groups, here's the male from that family, are gradually acclimated to the presence of humans. They're not tame, they get used to having humans come close, and the rest remain wild. Trekking fees support local economies by employing park rangers and guides. Trekkers need places to stay, and we support local businesses. Local farmers grow food crops, but are also supported in planting and maintaining tea fields around gorilla areas. Gorillas don't like tea. They must be coffee drinkers. Gorillas don't like tea, so it serves as a natural fence. Governments redistribute cash from tracking back into local communities in part because it lowers poaching. A large proportion of tourism dollars in Uganda, Rwanda, and Congo comes from gorilla trekking, so gorillas and humans alike, especially poor people who live in rural areas near gorilla habitat, benefit from well-managed trekking. Of course, this is one of the casualties of COVID-19 is this entire system. So I urge you, if you've thought about gorilla trekking, when you can, go back. It's a tough time there now. But this process of supporting gorilla trekking, some gorillas get used to having people around, the whole thing is an illustration of one part of my talk tonight. And I want to go in 4 steps. Now, a warning, any one of these steps could be a semester, give or take, in itself. So first, I'm going to offer a very brief description of integral ecology. Secondly, my focus within the web of challenges to our world today, the crisis in biodiversity. A while back in the Earth's history, a meteor crashed into the Earth and led to the extinction of the dinosaurs. This time, we humans are the meteor. We're causing the problem. The crisis we've caused threatens our survival too. We risk also being the dinosaur. Third, I want to ask a different kind of question. Not what must be done, but who must we be to respond well? And fourth, some very tentative suggestions about what we can do toward becoming the kind of people we need to be. So step 1, integral ecology. This is developed in Pope Francis's 2015 encyclical Laudato Si, but it draws on insights from numerous previous sources, including, of course, Francis of Assisi and the whole Franciscan spiritual tradition. Also, Jesuit anthropologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, Thomas Berry, the Catholic social tradition broadly, and most directly, it develops Pope Benedict XVI's observation in Caritas et Veritate that the way humanity treats the environment influences the way it treats itself, and vice versa. Cardinal Peter Turkson of Ghana has been an outspoken advocate for this vision of creation. Integral ecology takes note of a number of imminent crises facing humanity, including economic inequality, environmental degradation and climate change, competition for scarce resources, including food and water, and the ineffectiveness of governments in the face of transnational commercial interests. Mathematician David Pruitt notes, the integral in integral ecology is what's new. It realizes that these crises are not independent, but they're closely intertwined. The interwoven nature of the crises we face reveals a truth about creation. Pope Francis starts with the insight that we live in a web of relationships, and further, these relational webs are connected among themselves as well. So just as earlier strands of Catholic social teaching emphasize the bonds of common humanity that call us to solidarity, integral ecology invites us to think of ourselves and nature as creatures called to solidarity with all of creation. Quote, Nature cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves or as a mere setting in which we live. We are part of nature, included in it, and thus in constant interaction with it. We're not faced with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather one complex crisis which is both social and environmental. So as a result, strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time protecting nature. Francis calls out the misguided anthropocentrism that's characterized much of Christian tradition in dealing with nature, and points to how the biblical language of God giving humans dominion over the natural world in Genesis 1 yields an approach, usually, sadly, of domination of the natural world purely for human ends. We should read on, he says, to Genesis chapter 2, in which humanity is charged with tilling and keeping the land, protecting, overseeing, and nurturing a creation that remains God's, even as human beings are special. Further, Francis emphasizes that other creatures are not merely instruments created by God for human use. Each organism, as a creature of God, is good and admirable in itself. Indeed, it's the same casually dismissive or instrumentalizing stance toward the natural world that underlies social injustice. When the natural world is merely ours for the abusing, so human beings are merely goods to be used and discarded, and the suffering the poor is simply their bad luck. Since we recognize instead that everything is interconnected, the analysis of environmental problems cannot be separated from the analysis of the human family, work-related and urban contexts, nor from how individuals relate to themselves, which lead in turn to how they relate to others and to the environment. There's an interrelation between ecosystems and between the various spheres of social interaction. We can see, for example, how structures of inequality play out in the socio-environmental world. The rich nations of the world are responsible for much of the threat to the biosphere, while the poor bear the brunt of its effects. Further, the poor are disproportionately vulnerable to climate change, to the effects of climate change, and to the degradation of the natural environment. As the prophet Bono said in a slightly different context, the rich stay healthy while the sick stay poor. Francis casts a broad net in unpacking the various interwoven strands of integral ecology. In addition to the biological world, he considers economics, the ecology of history, art and culture, the ecology of daily life, the settings in which we flourish or flounder, including the grinding effect of extreme poverty on human dignity and the assault on beauty in our common life. Intergenerational justice, the kind of world we'll leave our children and their children, is an important criterion for Francis. Our responsibility to work for the common good extends not just across geographical boundaries, but across time into the future as well. And Laudato Si devotes an entire chapter to ecological education and spirituality, pointing to the need for ecological conversion, marked by the development of virtues enabling our commitment to that new vision. I'll take up some of those virtues he mentions later on. The deep interconnection of ethics and a spirituality that prompts, enlivens, and sustains ethical commitments is a hallmark of an adequate ethics for our time. Integral ecology is an intrinsically interdisciplinary task. Scientists of many stripes, philosophers, artists, sociologists, politicians, policy experts, economists, and even, I hope, theologians, all have a part to play in addressing the hydra-headed threat to human existence that we face. In this diagram, we see how some aspects of the biological and geological aspects of the climate crisis widely cast are doing now. We're already out into the danger zone on many of these and nearing the limit on others. Note that this graph doesn't show how human social and political changes may make things worse or better. Step 2. Now, Having first emphasized that everything is connected, now I'm going to take a look at just one aspect of the complex crisis that faces us, the loss of biodiversity. Why am I looking at one piece of this and not the whole thing simultaneously? Well, first, because ethics, especially the interdisciplinary ethics of integral ecology, requires attention to detail. I'm not going to exhaust even this topic, much less all the other aspects of the crisis, but I think I can say something about it. Second, I think we might each find a piece of the environmental crisis to which we feel particular resonance, and that's good. Confronted with the crisis before it, we might be tempted to despair or the sense that nothing we can do matters. Trimming down the focus a bit helps me to be a little more focused on ways forward instead of just running in circles saying, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. I'd like to ask us all to think about our own piece of the puzzle. What part of the challenges that we face are yours to address? Why focus on loss of biodiversity? The topic is appealing to me because biodiversity loss is relatively underreported compared to some other Earth crises. And secondly, my first training was as a veterinarian, so I'm drawn to biological questions, hence all the animal pictures. So let's go on. We are currently experiencing or on the brink of the Earth's sixth mass extinction, the first since the meteor annihilated the dinosaurs. The following data are from a report published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Extinction is one face of the biodiversity crisis, and here are some numbers. In the last century, 200 known species have become extinct. The number of extinctions one would ordinarily expect not in one century, but in, give or take, 10,000 years. Currently, there are more than 98,500 species on the International Union for Conservation of Nature Red List, and more than 27,000 are threatened with extinction, including nearly half of amphibians, 33% of reef-building corals, 1 in 4 mammals, 14% of birds. Overall, more than 27% of all assessed species are threatened with extinction. Further, the wholesale destruction of delicate habitats like rainforests make it likely that we're destroying entire species that we haven't even gotten around to naming. We will never know that they were ever here. But extinction is only one part of the picture. The disappearance of particular populations within species and the reduced number of individuals within populations are also alarm bells. Extinction, of course, is a biological dead end, but population loss, habitat decline also threatens a decline in genetic diversity, and that's essential for species to survive. So these pre-extinction events are the result of habitat loss, overexploitation, invasive organisms, pollution, toxification, climate disruption. It's a mess. Too much focus on extinction, though that's bad enough, is like locking the barn door after the horse is out. We also need to see how other factors stressing animal populations are in play before those cause irreversible population declines, then population loss, and we reach a point at which extinction is inevitable. Overall, wildlife abundance in the world has decreased as much as 58% from 1970 to 2012. Of mammals studied worldwide, nearly half have lost 80% of their range in the last century. Africa is worse than average. Here, more than half of mammals studied have lost more than 80% of their habitat. For example, according to the National Academy of Sciences report, the lion was historically distributed over much of Africa, Southern Europe, and the Middle East, all the way to northwestern India. It's now confined to scattered populations in sub-Saharan Africa and a remnant population in the Gir forest in India. The vast majority of lion populations are gone. The report concludes, we conclude that anthropogenic population extinctions amount to a massive erosion of the greatest biological diversity in the history of Earth. So I said sixth mass extinction. Why don't we just say that this is part of a natural terrestrial cycle? After all, we lost most of the dinosaurs, but their descendants, the birds and various reptile species, are still here. And after all, it was the destruction of the big reptiles that opened up the evolutionary landscape for little scurrying mammals to take over. Well, here's why. We as a species are responsible for this one. In moral theology, we recognize that people are responsible for evils they commit, even if the same evils occur naturally or randomly. Easy example, everybody will die. But if I murder someone, I'm responsible for that death and can't just shrug it off and say, well, he was going to die at some point anyway. Here, the catastrophic loss of biodiversity is the direct and indirect effect of human actions in the world. In this extinction, we are the meteor. Second, species self-interest. The loss of biodiversity in this mass extinction event threatens whole ecosystems, including the webs of life on which human beings depend. If we continue the way we're going, we will not only eradicate huge swaths of the created order, but we are likely to eliminate ourselves too. We're the dinosaur. Even if our species manages to survive, we're facing a calamitous future. Integral ecology leads us to observe that loss of biodiversity will exacerbate the social problems we face. We might anticipate, and we're beginning to see, massive migrations of desperately hungry and thirsty people, economic collapse of whole regions, destabilization of political structures, resource wars, especially perhaps for water and basic food. Diseases, diseases, though, especially related to pollution and medical infrastructure failure, and on and on and on. So, anybody depressed yet? So what will we do? Bad question. Bad first question. In my neck of the ethical woods, in virtue ethics, we focus first on the qualities of people that make us better, that are conducive to our flourishing individually and socially. Those qualities of characters are called virtues. We become virtuous by practice, by emulating the sorts of things that admirable people do, so that in time, we can become virtuous ourselves, which means that doing the right thing becomes easier as though we act by second nature. Aristotle wrote, we become builders by building, we become harpists by playing the harp. Similarly then, we become just by doing just actions, temperate by doing temperate actions, brave by doing brave actions. How is this going to work? Jim Keenan summarizes the path of virtue ethics in 3 basic questions. Who am I? Who am I called to become? And then only third is the question of action. How am I going to get there from here? So why this way of doing ethics for this kind of problem? Well, first, because by and large, virtuous people, people of good character, will at least try to do the right thing. This is especially important in situations in which exactly what the right thing is might not be clear. Second, because this form of ethics recognizes that virtues are portable from context to context. The just person justices, Gerard Manley Hopkins wrote, and a just person justices whenever they're in a situation in which justice is called for. Since the problems that we face are interconnected, it seems possible that the virtues we need to face them will be interconnected also. Third, virtues are human universals and virtues are refracted differently in different cultures. So, for example, everybody's called to courage. Great. But courage looks different in the life of, say, a theology student than it does in the life of, say, a fighter pilot. And so we also need to recognize that for human beings of different cultures, people will frame and respond differently to different aspects of these socio-environmental problems according to different cultural insights. culture isn't the last word. It is possible to critique aspects of different cultures if and because they're not conducive to flourishing. Okay, it sounds very like I'm hedging, but let me give you an example. Think about the American myth of the rugged individual, utterly alone, self-sufficient, proud of their self-made excellence. You know, it's just silly when you think about it, isn't it? Because, like, who here was born housebroken and able to feed themselves? We are all here because somebody cared for us when we could not even hold our own bottle up without help. So while we're all raised in particular cultural settings, culture isn't just something that happens to us. We shape it, create it, revise and deploy cultural resources, and we use those insights creatively. This is Anne Swidler's toolkit model of understanding culture. I also recommend the work of Professor Laurenti Magesa on the creative use of cultural insights in ethics. Further, in this globalized and televised age, we are all exposed to any number of cultural values, enculturated virtues and vices all the time. So now more than ever, we have a lot of cultural resources to work with. So having given you this very, very brief overview of how virtue ethics works, let's take it for a spin. Let's do those three basic questions. Who am I? Who am I called to become? And how am I going to get there? Who am I? First, I want to strongly affirm that Laudato Si insight, of course, it's a commonplace in the sciences, that we're not separate from the environmental world, the natural world. We're part of it. We're part of nature. Pope Francis warns against misguided anthropocentrism and also against its opposite, biocentrism. So what's biocentrism? Biocentrism denies a special or central role for humanity in the natural world and insists that we are merely one creature among many. It stupidly levels all creatures as equal, all the way from viruses to the people who suffer from them and everything in between. In this context, such an approach fails to see that in some ways we are uniquely responsible for the crisis before us, or the meteor. Since we created the problem, we have a special role in cleaning it up, right? The pottery barn rule. We are also able to use the distinctive traits of our species, technology, foresight, analytical skills, and the rest. And just as nations who have historically been responsible for climate change bear special responsibility and often special resources for combating it, so the crisis of loss of biodiversity is in many ways ours to work on. This misguided anthropocentrism of our species has been our more usual mistake. Throughout history, we've tried time after time to suggest a criterion that allegedly sets us humans apart from other animals. Every time we come to it, we come to see that our differences aren't quite so clear. Tool use? Well, okay, other species use tools like chimps and this very clever orangutan, but maybe a better example is this bird who has created the perfect tool for his use. How about intelligence? No, intelligence is all over the natural world. Everything that can react deliberately to influences upon it is intelligent to some degree and in some way. What about language? Yeah, other species use language, maybe not as complex as ours, at least we think that now. Maybe most of us, on the other hand, don't dance quite as well as hummingbirds do, or as honeybees do. What about morality? Other creatures show signs of ethical behavior, although their standards of ethics, not surprisingly, look different from ours. Self-awareness? Self-awareness is well established in several intelligent social animals. So the harder we try to set ourselves apart from other animals, the sillier we look. We see a parallel example to this in vastly exaggerated efforts to insist that one sex or one race is better than another, in which case we're not being merely silly, but too often we justify evil against others. It's the wrong question. Instead of focusing on what sets us apart, why not focus on what we have in common with non-human creation, which is far more substantial? I mentioned the scriptural issue before. In Genesis 1, we were given dominion over the earth, which we too often turned into domination of the natural world. In Genesis 2, we were to till and keep the land. But, even here, there's a tendency, I think, toward a human nature dualism that's untrue and unhelpful in our current context. I think we need to go one step further than Francis did. I think we need to really embrace the Franciscan insight, the Francis of Assisi insight, that we are brother and sister to the created order with a common mother, the earth. We should embrace our creatureliness alongside, not apart from other creatures. This doesn't mean, as I said just a minute ago, that our species doesn't have special responsibility and special traits that we have to use in dealing with this crisis. But we must see that our role in the community of the earth is with and for our fellow creatures. If we care about the loss of biodiversity, we must assume a preferential option for the endangered out of both our understanding of our interconnectedness and our human gifts to do this. Of course, many of you heard echoes there of the liberation theological saying that we must stand with and alongside the poor, and that we must assume a preferential option for the poor, not as a matter of charity, but as a matter of justice. And that's what's at stake here too. Aspects of indigenous religious traditions from all over the world might be helpful here. There are too many examples to name. But one thing that many of the pre-Christian religions have in common is that sense of the interconnectedness of humanity with the non-human world. American ethicist Cynthia Mo-Lobeda calls this socio-ecological vision ecocentrism. Ecocentrism. Who am I called to become? That second question of virtue ethics invites us to focus on the qualities of character, the virtues we're invited to develop. I have just pointed to solidarity with the natural world, standing with and alongside brother and sister in the non-human order in an ecocentric community. Liberation theology also teaches us that in situations of oppression, both the oppressor and the victim are harmed, though in different ways and to different degrees. Our desire to set ourselves apart from and over the non-human order is harming us, even as it is proving catastrophic to so many of our fellow creatures. There are a bunch of virtues I could name here, but I'm going to focus on these: humility, solidarity, courage, and impatience. First virtue we'll need to develop is humility. Humility is a virtue that has been way too often misdefined in Christian tradition. Humility is not, oh, I'm just nothing at all. True humility, real humility, is characterized not by discounting ourselves and our gifts, but by looking outside ourselves to see what else God is doing in the world. In this case, humility invites us to study the natural world and its interconnectedness, and so to understand our role in that web, not in denial of our intelligence, etc., but to see how we might use our gifts for the benefit of all, and to see the other gifts out there that we don't possess. Humility is a prerequisite for that virtue of solidarity, which enables effective collaboration. Solidarity in an ecocentric vision is solidarity with other people and also with and alongside natural systems. And here we can consider, for example, self-corrective mechanisms in ecosystems. And here's one well-known example. Wolves were eradicated from Yellowstone Park in 1930 and reintroduced in 1995. When the wolves were gone, elk multiplied, putting pressure on, among other things, the aspen and cottonwood trees, which they overate. Reintroducing wolves didn't diminish the overall elk population. In fact, they increased threefold Why? The pressure from the roaming wolves kept elk on the move, so they didn't put too much pressure on any one stand of aspen or cottonwood, so the elk had more to eat as they moved around. More trees means more songbird habitat. More trees means more shade for fish who prefer colder water. More trees meant more beavers could survive. Beavers build dams. So reintroduction of wolves, just one species, resulted in change in the flow of rivers and contributed to the flourishing of seemingly unrelated species like songbirds. Rivers that meander are more likely to flood and provide more habitat for trees and fish. More fish is good for bears. Wolves do a lot of good. Who doesn't like wolves? Well, ranchers whose young stock are sometimes eaten don't like wolves. Here, an emphasis on creativity over competition can help. Ranchers are now starting to use livestock guard dogs that can keep wolves away without killing them. But this requires a degree of humility from farmers and solidarity that values apex predators like wolves. That's what needs to be to be focused on. Is out of solidarity, creativity, and cooperation. Solidarity also requires a genuine curiosity and respect as to what the other might bring. Without focus on solidarity, we can too easily think that we only need to fix the human environment, disregarding the natural environment, and vice versa. Courage is the virtue of facing danger. Ignatian spirituality, the home spirituality, my home spirituality, hinges on availability for the work to which God calls us. But very often to set out in that work requires courage to overcome internal and external obstacles that stand in our way. In questions of loss of biodiversity, courage is a necessary virtue at many levels. Courage is needed in a visceral way for those working to oppose poaching, often at danger of death. We also need courage to challenge the predominantly economic justification for social policy, both regarding human beings and regarding the non-human world. How many times have you heard, for example, the practice of fracking described principally and basically totally in terms of its monetary, its economic value? There's an unfortunate tendency, I think, to reduce all things of value, human beings as well as the natural world, to what they're worth in terms of money. But it can seem naive or sentimental to reject that thinking and instead uphold the intrinsic dignity of human beings as well as non-human creation. We need courage to refuse to be shamed by those who want to see only one side of the socio-ecological world. We need courage to make changes in our own lives. And impatience. Sometimes people say that patience is a virtue, but I'm telling you now, that's usually not true. When people are told to tolerate injustice or to remain passive in an emergency, patience isn't a virtue, it's a vice. We find ourselves on the brink of an interconnected series of life-threatening crises. Patience is not a virtue. If we don't act soon, it'll be too late. Impatience, though it sounds cranky, is part of hope. It reflects hope. And hope, according to Thomas Aquinas at least, concerns the difficult possible future good. But hope, if it's to be effective, has to act. David Orr writes, hope is a verb with its shirt sleeves rolled up. How do we get there from here? We grow in virtue by education and experience, by reflecting on what we've done, and thinking about whether our actions are leading us to be more and more the people we're called to be. The central question, another way of framing this, how do I get there from here question of virtue ethics is think about what we're doing now and then ask, how's that working for you? The good news is that any small step forward is a good thing. We don't have to become socio-eco-justice warriors all at once. Every small step reveals the next step to us. Of course, vices, anti-virtues, work the same way. So we have to be vigilant. So here, the possibilities for how do we get there from here are endless. And once we engage creativity and once we're willing, and knowing that every effort counts, then the floor is open. Our task here is intellectual and it's spiritual. Cynthia Molobeda says that to counteract the socio-ecological crisis before us, we need to cultivate what she calls critical mystical vision. This proceeds in 3 steps. First, to see clearly what's going on. First, to see clearly what's going on. And that's why all the data in the first part of my talk. Then to imagine what could be and how that might come about and how we might act for it. That's what virtues do. They motivate us to act and shape our actions. And third, to recognize ever more clearly the Spirit of God coursing throughout creation, calling us not into battle, but into a dance of all with all. This is the hope that is born of IMpatience. So here I want to suggest a few possible practices, the kinds of actions or activities that might help us grow in these virtues. What I suggest is only a starting point. Again, the sky's the limit in terms of how we might proceed in these virtues. So here again, I'm going to focus on biodiversity. But we're each called to different parts of the puzzle, different ways of responding. So these suggestions aren't assignments. There may be some things that might help. First, we need to notice the biodiversity around us. We can't advocate for what we don't see. Pope Francis speaks of gratitude, but you can't be grateful for what you don't notice. More specifically, go somewhere wild and appreciate the complicated messiness of wild ecosystems. We human beings have a tendency toward monoculture. If we want corn, we kill everything else with pesticides and herbicides and guns and traps. But monoculture is the enemy of biodiversity because we have to kill so much to sustain one species. Here, I want to advocate for wild spaces of 2 kinds. One kind is where people can go. I think zoos and safari parks and the like have a role because, again, it's hard for us human beings to value what we don't see. And if you go, say, to the Oakland Zoo, to the Wild California exhibit, and look at the animals there, it gives us all an opportunity to just step back and say, wow, how utterly wonderful. But the second kind of wild space that we need to look at sustaining is where we can't go. Not every ecosystem can bear human intrusion. And one act of humility is to recognize that we can cause harm just by showing up. Again, that's an insight of liberation theology. With and alongside the poor doesn't mean to take over or even intrude on every possible space. We noticed in those families of gorillas that while some were acclimated to human presence, most were not. We need to start a conversation, I think. Another thing that contributes to this, another possible practice, is we need to have a better conversation about human population growth. On the one hand, it's absolutely true that right now we could feed the world, but we lack the political will to distribute resources justly. However, it's also true that the growth of the human population is one of the stressors of habitat for non-human species, and it's not sustainable. Third, we need to look for the triple bottom line in companies that we support. That is, organizations that evaluate their performance, not just in terms of financial profit, but also in terms of ecological and social impact. We need to read labels. Fair trade often indicates criteria of environmental sustainability as well as social justice. We need to learn about specific threats to wild populations. Deforestation to grow palm oil in Sumatra and Borneo threatens populations of orangutans, threatens the Borneo elephant and the Sumatran tiger. So read the labels of things like bread and ice cream and margarine, for heaven's sakes, that are likely to use palm oil, and buy another brand. That's a practice of solidarity. And most basically, fall in love. Fall in love with something non-human. Pedro Arrupe's famous poem about love concludes, fall in love, stay in love, and it will decide everything. Practice, I would say, cataphatic spirituality. Cataphatic spirituality, while it recognizes that no one image can capture the totality of the being of God, seeks glimmers or reflections of God in all creation. This is a quote from Adam Gopnik. He writes, "We are born trapped in our own selfish skins, and we open our eyes to the rings of existence around us. We open our eyes to see the wider circles only when new creatures come in, when we realize that we really sit at the center of a Saturn's worth of circles, stretching out from our little campfire to the wolves who wait outside, and ever outward to the unknowable, toward, I don't know, deep sea fish that live on lava, and then beyond toward all existence, where each parrot and every mosquito is, if we could only see it, an individual." Again, Adam Gopnik. Okay, maybe not mosquitoes, or at least I can't include them yet. But to conclude, integral ecology recognizes that everything is connected. The various ills that face us aren't discrete individual problems, but are an interconnected web of ills that require an interdisciplinary holistic response. Biodiversity loss is one facet of the crisis we face. In the mass extinction that's upon us, we are the meteor, we may well be the dinosaur too. To deal with this and the other socio-ecological crises that we face requires that we cultivate in ourselves the virtues that help us act well in a hard time. We don't all need to do everything. But if all of us just take on one aspect of climate crisis, know about it, think about what will change. Whatever tugs at our sleeves about this multidisciplinary problem, then we'll be taking one step toward addressing this existential challenge of our time. Together, these virtues that I've named serve the larger goal of justice. Here, not only justice among human beings, but justice between human beings in the natural world that God created and God delights in. I understand that a better translation of those repeated words in the first chapter of Genesis is that at every step in the creation narrative, God stops and marvels at how good it is. And now to my respondent, and then to all of our questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lisa. We have been listening to Dr. Lisa Fullam, who is a professor of moral theology at the Jesuit School of
My screen just froze.
So a toolbar will open up, and press the Q&A, and your little text box will open, and you can type your question there. We're going to go next, however, to Dr. David Larrabee, who is Professor Emeritus of Physics at East Stroudsburg University. In fact, he brings together advanced work in three fields. First of all, a PhD in applied physics, Cornell University, And if that's not enough, an MBA from Philadelphia University. And if that's not enough, a master's degree in systematic theology from Union Theological Seminary in New York City. And so now, I guess in retirement, he's able to explore the intersection of those three in economics, technology, and religion surrounding issues of the environment. David, I believe your mic is open, so let's go ahead to you.
Well, thank you. And thank you for that wonderful presentation. Although perhaps sometimes a little disturbing, the statistics you presented on biodiversity loss are staggering, and the human causes perhaps overwhelming. I have a couple questions. I'll try to keep them short. You talk about a special place of humanity, and too often we seem to err on the side of human benefit and hurtful for others. So I guess my question is, we're not an impartial observer. So who decides how special we are, and what should we do that, and how to do that? How do we prevent ourselves from putting ourselves in such a privileged position that it hurts others? And I'm thinking in terms of what's called the ladder of life, in the sense that we in theology, we have God and angels and then humans and on down. And so most of us naively think that human beings are more important than animals, which are more important than plants, which are more important than rocks. And yet, if we're a bush, somehow we have to alter our value system. And so it would be interesting to me to hear you talk about not just the virtues, but how our values, especially instrumental versus intrinsic values, plays with virtues. I think the second question I would have is a little bit more a pragmatic one. How has the church's role in bringing this message to the local congregations, how is it going? Certainly in the evangelical community, has not gone particularly well. And how do we as Christians make that transition to those that really see human beings as the pinnacle of God's creation, and therefore of the utmost importance? And I guess the third question is timescale. It seems that the time is awfully short, and eco-conversion, if you will, seems to me would take an awfully long time to get enough people on this track to make a global difference. So as we are traveling down this path, which I certainly agree with, how do we bridge that gap? What do we do in the interim? Because the problems are imminent. So I'll leave it at that and give it back to you.
Thank you very much. And a fellow Cornellian, go Big Red. Well, let me go in order. You asked first about the place of humanity in all of this, and who decides how special we are. And here I want to geek out for just a moment. There are two virtues that Thomas Aquinas was wrestling with. One of them he got from Aristotle, and it was called magnanimity. Magnanimity is doing the greatest good thing that we can. Like all virtues, it has a vice on either side of it. People who have too much of what looks like magnanimity just look silly because they're trying to do more than they can. But people who don't have enough magnanimity are what Aristotle called unduly humble people, and they're dangerous because they don't do the good they can in the world. But the other virtue then is a virtue that Thomas got from St. Paul of humility. And humility has vices on either side. One of them is pride, and one is kind of like pusillanimity, kind of like the opposite of magnanimity. Again, small-souledness, being too tiny and not being magnanimous and big and effective. I say that because to say who decides how special we are inheres in that, again, I'm still geeking, in that balance between magnanimity, which is a virtue, and humility, which is also a virtue. The way we wade through that thicket, I think, is to understand that our flourishing, our self-interest, really inheres in common interest. Our individual good as an individual species, our personal individual good as members of one species, really hinges on, quite in a literal way, depends on the flourishing of other species as well. So there's a way in which, yeah, people are kind of, we're fallen. Humans have fallen from grace, and in that fall, we tend to be self-centered to a grand extent, but our self-centeredness is killing us. And so I think the way through is that same basic question: how's this working for us? As California burns and as Florida gets swept up in storms over and over again. This question, the question that you raised of instrumental versus intrinsic value, if we looked at nature in a purely instrumental way and still understood that our survival as a species, now I'm speaking very selfishly as a human first person, that our survival as a species is dependent on our taking good care of the ecosystem around us, that's going to get us to where we need to be. But as a spiritual dynamic and as a motivating force, that notion of the intrinsic value of other creatures is what will keep us going when we're tired. It's that notion of these things are important, not just because I like them or don't like them, but because they are. A friend of mine once pointed me to the creation narrative, not in Genesis, but in Job, when God talks back to Job and tells Job about all of these creatures. None of them are clean creatures, clean, good for human use. It's Leviathan and Behemoth and a whole range of wild animals that humans don't have access to. And God was asking Job, aren't these great? And Job had to say yes. Our scripture itself points us to that notion of intrinsic value, and we'll be better at doing this saving the earth thing if we can get to that intrinsic value. Plus, it'll be more fun. Yeah, the church's role, huh? Yeah, remember that little thing I put in about we have to start a conversation about human population? That was mostly aimed at Catholics. I had a whole nother paragraph that wasn't really relevant for this kind of gathering. I really think the churches have kind of dropped the ball. All the churches. Laudato Si was largely, well, depends who you ask, right? Theologians picked up Laudato Si and really ran with it. It wasn't ignored to the extent that Pope Francis's next major document, Amoris Laetitia, and questions of sexual ethics was ignored and opposed. But it's a start when at least the leader of one Christian community says, boy, we've really got to take steps here. And I think this question of how the churches need to be involved has to start at the bottom. It has to start with local congregations, ordinary parishioners, and especially where we recognize now in the Christian community, there used to be an unfortunate tendency to think in clericalist terms that the clergy lead the church and the people are sheep. Well, that's just nonsense, right? Most churches now are composed of extraordinarily well-educated, motivated people. We have to think also of the churches as communities of endeavor that can launch into this. Time is very short. Yeah. Time is very short, maybe 10 years. We have maybe 10 years to make a significant difference. And unfortunately, in the United States, we've politicized a lot of the questions around environmental justice. I think what it's going to take is a combination of two things. I think it's really going to take law and education. And I think the law is going to be fiercely opposed. But time is so short that questions of environmental regulation have to be put into law. And then we have to educate people. We can think of other kinds of crises in our nation's history. Well, Rachel Carson, right, wrote about DDT, and then it was conveniently made illegal. And honestly, I don't know enough about the history of that to know how that all came about. But I think there's going to have to be a both and. I think there needs to be legal action because we do not have time to convince everyone. But if the law is there, and as people resent the law, oh, we got to try to bring people into the conversation. And part of what I think is going to bring people into the conversation is that the spiritual delight that can be had, because that's what changes people's hearts. The particular stories of species, their beauty, is what changes people's hearts more than anything. Just to start, but maybe let's open it up to further questions, unless David, if you wanted to say more.
And just briefly, yeah, thank you for the responses. I said in my Protestant or evangelical tradition, we have probably even a worse history than the church does at the moment. So yeah, so thank you for your comments, and I'll open it up for the audience. And a good, nice presentation. Thank you much.
Thank you, David.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you again, Lisa, for engaging David and now being willing to engage everyone else. A reminder to the audience that the question and answer function is open. Go to the bottom of the screen and open the Q&A box and then type your question in. I have a few questions that I've already received, and let me start with the very first one that came in. It's got an interesting phrase in it, and I'll read the whole question as it is in just a second, but it includes the phrase scripture from the natural world. And I'm not quite sure what is meant by that phrase, but maybe that's part of the question. What is scripture from the natural world? But Elizabeth writes this: Hebrew and Christian scriptures are fundamental to our worship, speaking, of course, of Christian communities. From your explorations, do you think that our corporate worship could be enhanced by having scripture from the natural world, provided by science, in addition to God's creation scripture?
Huh. Okay. Short answer, yes. But then I know enough liturgists to say, golly, that would start a lot of fights in churches. But what might that look like? So what I'm imagining is, in part, this is going to have to be the work of preachers, right? There's so much in canonical scriptures that is misread or read only as it might have been aimed at a small population of Middle Eastern nomads, right? Back the earliest texts, all the way up to more or less urban people under the thumb of Rome for much of the New Testament. And so we have to read scripture partly in recognizing that it was meant for different people in a different time, and that part of the work of scripture, using scripture for ethics generally, is to translate, is to see, okay, what's really going on in this message, and how do we bring that into our time? What's the meaning here? And when you say scripture, Elizabeth, when you say scripture from the natural world, you mentioned science, and I don't know if you mean science like E equals MC squared, which, as any scientist know, right? Once you get into science, you find yourself falling face first into awe, and it's hard for that not to be a point of religious conversion on the side of nature. The other way of thinking about scripture from the natural world is that I think, is the very heart of cataphatic spirituality. I remember just a silly story. I was on retreat once, and you know how when you're on retreat, you get this very, very focused vision. You're noticing everything and paying close attention to everything. And there happened to be a giant slug on the railing just outside the chapel where I had just gone to liturgy. And I don't know if you've ever looked at the eyes of slugs, but they have the most beautiful eyes you've ever seen. And it might have been just one of those silly trapped in retreat, noticing things I wouldn't otherwise notice. But I've always carried that with me as a sense of how to step into awe, and it's all around us. So scripture from the natural world, yeah, I don't know if that means a little chunk of Einstein in the place of, say, the epistle, which often, in my perspective, isn't as fun as the gospel anyway, or if you mean the cultivation of a community's awareness of and appreciation for the natural in the work of the preacher and in the work of retreat directors, which I think would work also. Great idea.
There we go. Thank you. So the obvious question that has occurred already to you, Lisa, I think it is referenced by David, but it's also referenced by several people in the Q&A stream here. And that is church opposition to birth control and the issue of human population. There's a certain frustration that people outside faith communities feel. And as a Protestant, I have to say that it's also targeted, I think, to evangelical Christians, particularly in the United States, who have commended large families and certainly have followed suit in many, many situations. So it's not simply the Roman Catholic hierarchy, but it is, of course, the Roman Catholic hierarchy that is involved in this. Now, we all know that you have wrestled with this question probably longer than you would care to admit. What's the way forward here? Do you have any thoughts about how this obvious problem can be resolved?
Yep. Yeah. Resolved, I don't know. And I'm gonna refrain, though just barely, from turning this into my 3-hour lecture on birth control in the Catholic tradition. But the short version is this. Deep in Catholic tradition is a norm that you shouldn't have more children than you can feed and educate. And back when that was originally thought up, I know it's in Aquinas, it probably predates him as well. That was understood in a very simple, literal way, right? You got to feed them, you got to educate them. But if you think in global terms, right now we are in danger of having more children than we can feed. And we are in danger of having more children than will survive. And so I think the question of human population has to be asked. One of the reasons that many people gave for ignoring Laudato Si's pro-environmental message in the non-Catholic side was that he ducked the question of contraception in a most, I think, irresponsible way. He did say in one of those airplane comments that got picked up, he said, "There's nothing in Catholic tradition that says people have to breed like rabbits." That's a quote. It's true. The entire question in Catholic theological tradition is how you limit the size of your family. And there's been buckets of ink spilled by people way smarter than I, challenging that teaching of the church. Because of political reasons that I'll spare you, that's part of the 3-hour version, it has become a shibboleth of Catholic orthodoxy. And it's a step backward in tradition. I've argued that before. It's a step backward toward a more medieval understanding of sex and sexuality. It's physicalist, which means it points to the physical structure of something as its moral meaning, which is just silly. It is among the most widely ignored teachings in Catholic tradition. and yet the hierarchy hangs on to it as a marker of Catholic orthodoxy. It's changing in fact. Right now, the question of birth control is really only an issue in seminaries and among the Catholic hierarchy. The Catholic people have decided, and they've decided yes. As with many things in religious traditions and certainly in Catholic tradition, what needs to happen is more conversation, right? More recognition that when an entire faith community says, yes, but that teaching is nonsense, functionally nonsensical, that maybe the teaching itself needs revision. It's got to be addressed, or we'll all die.
Thank you. Yeah, very, very thoughtful, as I expected. It's a it's a huge challenge. So a couple of questions kind of connect together here. A certain well, your virtue of impatience. A couple of people, I think, maybe took that up to a couple of degrees higher, maybe where you didn't quite intend, but the premise here, I think, is that regardless of what anybody does in 2020 or 2025 or 2030, things are going to get worse. And in fact, things are getting worse. Well, Michael uses the phrase, it feels like a civilization destroying calamity. Civilization destroying calamity. Yeah. How do we, I think, Lisa, maybe the tone underneath these questions is virtue ethics really enough? Or if I could put it really bluntly, is virtue ethics asking us to be nice when the time for being nice has just simply run out? If we're facing a civilization destroying calamity, well, again, your virtue of impatience maybe needs to be elevated to a higher level here. But I certainly sense an impatience in what Michael has written, but even more in what Nancy has written. And she refers to a book that I don't know, Kim Stanley Robinson, The Ministry for the Future. I don't know the book, but apparently it contemplates, or it refers to younger people. I don't know if these are in the United States or elsewhere, but younger people who see the situation as so desperate that they are actively considering violence, targeting CEOs of corporations. So killing the most dangerous CEOs, this is Nancy writing, and sabotaging the activities that are destroying the planet. Easy to say killing is wrong, but what if traditional moral values are failing to save our children's generation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. First, a tiny bit of geekery. Thomas Aquinas, in his Summa Theologiae, went to bat in favor of tyrannicide, in favor of killing the king, if the king was acting for the king's own self-interest and not for the common good. Thomas didn't say who got to decide who was a tyrant. Thomas didn't say who gets to kill the tyrant. Thomas didn't give any details. He just said, if the leader is a tyrant, then you get to kill him. And so I think the first thing to recognize about such a challenge is, should we consider violence against the people involved? It's like, it's not ruled out if it fits into just war theory, and that's where we run into trouble. I really don't think, despite the number of acres of rainforest that has turned into grazing land for Big Macs, I really don't think that killing the CEO of McDonald's will make a damn bit of difference. The problem with McDonald's isn't the board. The problem with McDonald's is that everybody likes it. and everybody buys it. If we stop buying it, they go out of business. Then that's the way you kill a multinational. You don't kill the people running it. You stop using their product. But the deeper question, I think, and I wrote about this back when people were fighting about whether civility was a virtue or a vice. And I said, no, civility is very important. And civility is not the same thing as being nice. Civility is recognizing that on the other side of the struggle that we're in, either everybody else has to die or we have to get along. We have to imagine who do we want to be through and on the other side of this so that we can imagine a future together. And is that possible? If it's not possible, then all we're going to do is we're going to wind up in a Hobbesian war of all against all. But I think since we've seen, for example, the witness of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa, the Gacaca courts in, I want to say Rwanda, dealing with horrific violence. And again, those aren't models that you can just pick up and drop into the United States, or you can't just pick them up and drop them into climate change. They need to be adapted culturally and contextually. But I think the real question here is, who do we want to be on the other side? In virtue ethics, you become what you do. And if I decide, like those young people perhaps who are thinking about becoming an eco-army, if I decide that I'm gonna kill the bad guys, does that make me an eco-just person, or does that just make me a person who's so frustrated that they kill?
Thank you, very helpful. In your example of McDonald's, obviously it could be filled by many, many corporations that seem to be not wanting for customers. What, in terms of virtue ethics theory, what are we making of ourselves when we patronize corporations that are not exactly good for the environment?
That's right. That's right. And all of us are tied up with those corporations, right? I think my sweater is half plastic. It'll outlive me. So we're all tied up in them now. And that one of the things that I like about virtue ethics is emphasis that every step changes you.
Right.
Another way of thinking about virtue, another example is think about the ways in which people become musicians, right? The first time you pick up your guitar, it hurts like the dickens and it sounds terrible, right? But since you know there are good guitar players, you know you can become one. But as you learn how to play the instrument, then you begin to figure out how you not just play the notes, but express yourself. And so then the horizon goes forward.
Right.
One of the most dangerous things, I think, in virtue ethics is for people to imagine that they have acquired any virtue, right? We're always on the way.
Right. That's helpful. Elia, I think I'm pronouncing it right, also expresses this tone of impatience and likes that theme, of course, the way you work that in. But she writes, or he writes, it seems like to address the structural sin that causes climate change and biodiversity loss, impatience needs resistance as another virtue. Well, that's beginning to sound like Protestant Reformed ethics, back to the 30s and Karl Barth and resistance and all of that. What place does the theme of resistance have in virtue ethics? Or maybe a related theme would be conversion. At what point do I awaken and say, look, this enough of the Happy Meals already. I need a transformation of consciousness. I need to move from complicity through conversion to resistance. How does that play out in the virtue ethics tradition, at least as you're reworking that tradition today.
Yes. Yeah. Now help me here with the history. I have seen pictures of Roman Catholic bishops making the Nazi salute. Whereas my understanding is that among the most effective resistors of Nazism were those of the school of Karl Barth, the what we would call more conservative evangelicals, pietists. Is that so?
Well, it's a little confusing. I mean, Barth authored the Barmen Declaration, which resisted the Nazi takeover, but it didn't mention anti-Semitism. And very shortly thereafter, I mean, Barth did stand up to the Nazi-appointed judges, but very shortly retreated, moved back to his native Switzerland. And they expected to be invaded, but he was safe there. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is the icon in Protestantism of costly discipleship. In fact, his most famous work, The Cost of Discipleship, hanged by the Nazis for his complicity in the plot to assassinate Hitler, just 2 weeks before the prison is liberated. But I've read somewhere that more clergy, Protestant clergy, died in Nazi uniforms than died resisting the Nazis. So we latch on to resistance, and I've taught it as well. Because when things are horribly corrupt, resistance is the right thing. But the track record, well, resistance requires courage,
Yes.
right? But how does that play? I mean, there is no canonical virtue of resistance. Is that correct?
Well, yes and no, right? We're called to be people of justice. Justice is the virtue, depending on how you can define justice in a bunch of ways, but at the end of the day, justice is about how we regard our relationship to people generally and how we regard the state of the distribution and sharing of the goods of the world. Right. And if and to the extent that the world isn't just, then people of justice, people who are trying to develop in themselves a greater appreciation for the people for the virtue of justice, need to take another step, another step, another step. My favorite example of how people learn justice is what I understand is a mom trick. If you have 2 kids and 1 cupcake, what do? Always somebody raises their hand and says, 1 kid cuts, the other kid picks their half first. And that, I think, is it's an exercise of justice, right? Because that's the kid that later on you can say, you get all these Christmas presents, you know, the poor kids don't get any, you want to give one of your presents, and they say, yes, like that cupcake. And then we begin to see how that works out in social work. But to come back to resistance, yeah, resistance is a practice, can be a practice of justice. How do we know when it's right? Well, we all live, for good and ill, we all live in multiple moral communities at once, right? People of faith live in their faith community, which offers us a vision of what human life should be and should be like. American culture offers us a picture of human excellence and what our lives should be like. Commercial culture is related to American culture, right? And gives us yet a third vision of what the good life is. And I think that we are all always offered these and called then to say, really, how's that working for us? And at some point, you have to sign on to at least some aspects. Every morally creative person will grab this and this and this and this, the same way religiously eclectic people will grab this from this and this and this and make something that is truly our own. But if and to the extent that this ecological crisis promises to destroy humanity, then even if American consumer culture is saying, no, wear more plastic clothes, at some point we have to say, no, we have to stand against that because it is wrong and hurtful and dangerous. And there again, you know, Thomas on the killing of tyrants. We're faced with a kind of a tyranny of consumerism, a tyranny of forms of capitalism that promise endless growth and consuming, which can't happen.
Yeah, thank you very much. And your reminder about justice in the Thomistic tradition, that's an extremely important motif in terms of cashing itself out in modern American history. I mean, you would not have the idea of an unjust law, right, without that tradition. And that's the letter from Birmingham jail. That's what motivates Martin Luther King to denounce certain laws and resist. Right, so that's exceedingly important.
Okay.
Let me take you back, though, to maybe right almost early on in the talk, or to the core of it. Okay, so you reference the critique. Right, what's the big deal? Exterminations, species loss. It's happened before. It'll happen again. Only an exaggerated sense of our own importance might lead us to think that this one is special. Yeah, this one's on us, but so what? You know, does it really matter whether it's an asteroid or human neglect of the natural world? Well, so let's think about what makes humanity special, and why we should care especially about anthropogenic consequences. And Tariq writes, we are special because we alone amongst creation have the freedom of choice. You might add to that consciousness about these things, but freedom of choice. Only we should not look at ourselves as superior in terms of acting as masters, but rather behave as trustees. His word, trustees. We are borrowing from our children, as some have said. So let's use Tariq's question as an invitation back into that core. If human beings are the problem, why don't we just let the earth get over us? Right? Okay, so go ahead.
Yeah. Of course, that won't work, right? If we continue this way, we are already seeing the grim and deadly effects, the grim and deadly toll. One question then is, how do we make people care about all of these species? And that's related to, I think, the question about how do we make people make moral changes in their lives generally. And while I will take a backseat to nobody in my left-brained, let's make a logical argument stance, I also know that if you want to change someone's heart, you tell a story. And that's why I think there is such an important role for any kind of environmental awareness that takes the form of telling stories that draws people in. That's why I started and ended with my friend, the Ugandan gorilla. And I have to say, when the little group of us were standing there, some of us were weeping just at the sight. And that's what changes people's moral motivation. And then the arguments help, right? You change a heart first, and then the mind comes along. And so I think shaming people into this won't help. You're a bad species. You got to stop and be a better species. If we want to change our human behavior, we have to let ourselves love. This notion of being trustees for the generation to follow is really interesting, because until fairly recently, my understanding is that the notion of intergenerational justice was thought to be absurd, because how can you be just to people who do not yet exist?
Right.
And of course, now it's becoming clear that we're trying to be just to people that, unless we are just to them, they may not ever exist. But to think of with imagination of the kind of earth we want to leave, do we want to have been seen as good stewards in this time? But yeah, the path to consciousness raising then, or conscience raising, I should say, is a path through imagination and stories in the heart. That's why, you know, I put tigers and elephants and monkeys in my slides.
Hmm.
While of course little unphotogenic things are threatened too.
Hmm.
You know, it's easy to love a whale. It's harder to love plankton, but without plankton, the whale dies. so
Interesting, yeah.
but we're limited, right? When you teach a kid to count, right? You teach them with easy things, blocks to count, right?
Right.
Similarly, when we're trying to love things, we start to think with things that are easy to love.
Yeah.
And then work out from there.
Right. Well, this is very helpful. I think we have time for just one more question, and it kind of builds on the theme that you've just developed, this idea of the importance of the story, the narrative, touching the heart, inspiring the imagination. So let me just read this question, and you can use it for your kind of a summary comment, and I think we'll have to sign off at that point. So Jennifer writes, how can the church really effectively work in and with people groups and governments to reverse the loss of habitat, poaching, and other annihilation of animals around the world? Is it possible?
Yeah. That's the $24,000 question, $48,000 question, some $1,000 question. If it's not possible, then the next generation is doomed. But how can the churches do this? How can we change the church's imagination? I think part of it becomes taking a close look, and oddly, these COVID-19 times are a really good opportunity for that. Taking a close look at how the churches function. How do we consider ourselves? How do we make of ourselves a community? I had a group of students who did this really brilliant project one semester. They looked at, they said, where does the wheat for our communion wafers come from? And it turns out most of it's grown by, what's the group? Archer Daniels McDonald, one of the worst bad actors of monoculture. And they were like, you know, damn, every time we have communion, we're complicit in the worst of agricultural depredation. I think we should look in terms of, I think the season of Advent is upon us, right? If we think about the season of Advent, not a penitential season, but a kind of a, let's get ready for the inbreaking of the reign of God season, then how do we, the church, have to change in order to be part of that ongoing reign of God? If God cares, again, this is God in the book of Job again, right? If God cares about Leviathan and Behemoth and the mountain goats, then we're called as creatures created in God's image and likeness to care for Leviathan and Behemoth and the mountain goats as well. I think we can use our liturgical resources, our spiritual resources, to get us a little bit closer. If we can't, then the churches are on the wrong side and they don't have good news for the earth. But if the churches are in fact the mediators, not the possessors, right? But the mediators of a good news that comes from the divine to all of the earth, then we must be able to transform ourselves into being good news for the non-human as well as the human. And again, we can start with things like, where do our communion wafers come from? We can, you know, we can ask about whether we want to continue meeting in buildings that need to be heated. We can ask about inviting a congregation to, instead of fasting from something silly like, well, maybe chocolate maybe not be silly. It's hard to find fair trade chocolate, but you know, Lenten observances could be, let's invite people to Meatless Monday for Lent, right? It's 7 weeks. Give it a try. If it's over and you can't do it, then stop. So we could be a lot more deliberate. And again, small things become bigger things. So yeah, that's what I've been trying to argue, and why I think another reason that I think virtue is such a good way toward this is it is very tempting, and I feel it myself, to just say, it is too late, there's nothing we can do. If it's too late and there's nothing we can do, then we're still faced with a fundamental choice. Who are we going to be in this time of it being too late and nothing left to do? So let me quote Julian of Norwich. Julian of Norwich, one of my favorite, she was an anchorite, so she lived in a cell, right? She was sheltering in place. Right? But in the middle of really catastrophic plague in her time, she prayed to God to see something true, and God told her, all shall be well. So in this time of plague, the people of Norwich were going in two directions, right? One where the God is going to judge us, so let's be really strict and abstemious and stuff, and they were no fun at all. And the other side was, God has already judged us, so we might as well party, and they were no help at all. But in the middle, there's Julian saying, all shall be well. That's the kind of confidence that we have to walk forward in this time of peril, is if all shall be well, how do we participate? How do we make that come to be?
Thank you so much. And thank you for returning us in the end there to one of the theological virtues, that of hope. Thank you very, very much. Thank you everyone for participating. Thank you to our respondent, and thank you to our main speaker, Dr. Lisa Fullam.